Welcome to Independent Truths with Scott Atlas, brought to you by the Independent Institute. Today's guest is Heather MacDonald, one of the country's most important voices who exposes the truth and the data behind it. And that's important, of course, in any discussion about American society. Heather is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal. She is a recipient of numerous prizes, is a best-selling author of many books. Her most recent prize is the 2025 Edmund Burke Award. She's received the 2022 Jeane Kirkpatrick Prize for Academic Freedom, the Bradley Prize before that, and on and on. Stay tuned. We have much to discuss. Welcome, Heather. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's a pleasure being with you.
So we have a lot to talk about. You always do a great job of being empirical on some of these things that are so obvious they need the data backing it up. But the first thing I want to talk about, it's been almost a decade since your very important book, War on Cops, actually. Time flies. Yet the war on cops is not smaller, in my view. In fact, it's expanded, including a war on ICE, the anti-immigration forces. And in fact, to me, it seems like there's even a bigger push to viewing the criminal as the victim. I just think there's a lot of upside down logic going on. And it's almost a perversion of logic, really. But in the meantime, real people are being harmed, hurt, and even killed at some point. So I want to get your take on what's happened over the past, several years with this, because this is not a new problem.
Well, in the most immediate history, the mainstream media is promoting the fact that violent crime has come down from the explosion that occurred during the George Floyd race riot hysteria, the mass psychosis that took over this country, that was targeted rhetorically overwhelmingly at the cops. An amplification of what you say, Scott, has been going on for years, which is the shooting the messenger response. Yes, we have a big problem of violent crime in this country, and it's sadly racially tinged. The vast majority of violent crime disproportionately is committed by Blacks, and for that reason, we don't want to talk about it, and we blame the police for going where the crime is, and that's in inner city neighborhoods, and trying to protect the good law-abiding residents of those neighborhoods. But that means that they will disproportionately stop and arrest black criminals. Sorry, that's the facts. If you look at the homicide data, the bodies don't lie. We can talk about white supremacy all we want. The fact of the matter is that Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun homicide at 25 times the rate of whites in those same ages. Who's shooting them? Not the cops, not whites, but other Blacks. So the cops are they're dealt a racially disparate hand. They try to respond, and the media jumps on them. That has been going on for 2 decades. We first have the driving while Black phenomenon. We had Michael Brown hoax in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 that led to the Ferguson effect of cops backing off. And then worse of worse was George Floyd, the sanctification of a petty criminal, and the idea that he was killed because of white supremacy. The cops backed off. In 2020, homicide had the largest one-year increase in our nation's history, 29%. It stayed high for a while. Last year, it has dropped. Homicides nationally, by preliminary estimates, are down about 14% nationally. Nevertheless, you're absolutely right, Scott. We still have a considerable portion of the elite establishment that is willing to jump on the anti-cop bandwagon, and of course is also applying extraordinary double standards when it comes to crime. Though crime is down as a statistical matter. It is still outrageously high, and I'm gonna be
Right.
the first to admit that conservatives, if the data shows crime is going up, we're gonna talk the stats, and if it's going down, we're gonna talk the anecdotes. I'm gonna talk the anecdotes here. The anecdotes are totally unacceptable. We saw, on July 26th, this racial beatdown in Cincinnati. We had the Los Angeles illegal alien rides attacking, as you say, Scott, ICE, federal agents, and the thing that's different now in 2025 that is so salutary, so refreshing, is we have a president in the White House who is not going to make excuses. He is not going to brush any of this under the rug. He has a very simple standard. One act of violence is too many and it's unacceptable. And so he has in recent days uh, brought out more federal authority, more National Guard, which he has the complete constitutional right to do in Washington, D.C., following this beatdown over the weekend in D.C. of a 19-year-old Doge employee who was surrounded by 10 juveniles who were going to hijack his car. He tried to fight them off and was ruthlessly beaten. And Trump posted this on social media and said, "This is completely unacceptable. We're gonna take over DC if they can't get their house in order." This is a perfectly appropriate response that for decades nobody has been willing to do.
Yeah, what I find fascinating, before we talk about even the harms that are so obvious of what's the discussion of excusing crime, is it, you have to wonder, why is that the discussion? Why is it that we see so many so-called pundits or whatever? I have the displeasure of running on a treadmill where I am in a gym in Palo Alto, where you can imagine the TVs up from the ceiling are all MSNBC and CNN because I'm in Palo Alto. But
Oh,
I
that makes you
listen.
run harder. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, I watch what they say, and the first of all, the crimes aren't even reported.
Right.
But second of all, I feel it's a lot of it is part of still the severe hate of Donald Trump and everyone who supports Donald Trump. It's more than just the crime. Whatever he said, if he says, we need more enforcement of the law in Washington D.C. to stop crime, I feel part of the initial reaction is no, because whatever Trump says, the answer is no. But secondly, this whole idea of you're a racist if you arrest a minority, even though the minority has committed the crime, has really been very harmful in so many ways. Number one, as you have written and always talk about, it's handcuffed the police. Okay, you can't do your job if you're under suspicion of being a racist by making the arrest. And it, I think, dissuades people from being cops. I don't know where we're going with that. But secondly, it's harming black neighborhoods because black people is live a lot of times, poorer people also, in areas where there's higher crime. And if you don't enforce the law, they're the ones who are hurt. I would imagine that there's no one living in a neighborhood filled with crime that does not want crime stopped, unless you're a criminal. So it's hurting them, and this is such a perversion of logic by the liberal whites who are professing that you're a racist if you call out that there was a black kid who beat up the white guy. But then the third part is it creates a massive racist division in the country. And I feel this is the most tragic thing of all going on with this misguided narrative, because you're creating a racist society. You can't have a diverse society of racial diversity if everyone hates everybody and accuses the other side of being racist. And this is the bigger picture. And I don't know where we're going with that. So I don't even know if there's a question in there, but I sort of wanted to hear your take on some of these issues beyond the fact that it's really, causing more crime by handcuffing police.
Well, I spent years going into inner city neighborhoods and police community meetings and recording the voices of those hardworking people there who were begging for more cops. You know, the wonderful elderly ladies in these fantastic hats who would stand up in the middle of the police community meeting in the 43rd precinct in the Bronx, saying, "How lovely when we see the police. They are my friends."
Right.
And their voices never get covered by the New York Times. And so, you know, as an outsider coming in, it is an obvious strategy and it's a completely legitimate one just to make your argument, which is that, but come on, if you're going to emasculate the police, if you're going to discourage proactive policing, if you're going to sue the police for racial profiling, if they simply go where the crime is and make arrests on a constitutional colorblind fashion of who's committing the drive-by shootings, which in New York is 100% virtually blacks and Hispanics. Whites are not committing drive-by shootings, and that's true in virtually every other city. Blacks and Hispanics have an almost monopoly on this type of violent street crime. So the cops cannot respond. There's nobody doing the drive-bys who's white for them to stop and arrest. They cannot respond with having a disparate impact. But if you sue them all the time, if you tell them that they are absolute pariahs and racist, they're gonna walk away. They don't have to make those stops. So, yes, I have made that argument that this is perverse. If you care about Black lives, you do not demonize and stigmatize the cops. You give them support. On the other hand, I'm gonna be very honest here, Scott, uh, that anti-cop narrative is not supported only by white liberals. There are Black politicians
Mhm.
who embrace it as well. Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, when he was mayor there, used to complain about the fact that the Chicago police do not have the same penalties for illegal gun possession as in New York City, and he and his police chief would periodically go to go to Springfield and ask for stronger gun laws, and he would be voted down by the Black caucus, because they would rather not put more Black criminals in prison than protect the law-abiding Blacks in their neighborhoods. So this is a multiracial game that ultimately you ask what's the motivation behind it? Uh, there's a sort of a larger anti-bourgeois, anti-establishment reflex that has been in the United States among the elite since the 1960s. Law and order is associated with redneck Republicans. But frankly, it's sad, but it's also very racially influenced. The
Right.
fact is that America turns its eyes away from the degree of social breakdown and social pathology that gives us crime rates that are so disparate. In Los Angeles, for example, Blacks are 57 times more likely to commit a homicide than a white person. They're 36 times more likely to commit a robbery than a white person. Those are not unique numbers. Those type of disparities happen in every big city. And instead, rather than talking about that, talking about the family breakdown, we are all forced to live a lie. It
Right.
is
I mean, this is
psychologically stressful that we have to embrace this phony narrative that whites are the threat to Blacks. We hear this again and again. We heard it from Biden. We heard it from Obama that Black parents were right to fear that their child would be shot every time they stepped outdoors. Implication by a cop or by a white person. No. Yes, Black kids face an astronomically higher rate of being shot. After George Floyd, 100 times greater chance of being shot if you're a Black juvenile than if you're a white juvenile. Again, that's because the Black gun shooting rate is that much higher, and yet we're all told it's the whites that are the problem, and whites go along with it.
right. And then, there's another distortion of statistics. You alluded to it earlier when we see that crime rates have, quote, come down. Violent crime rates have come down. And we're talking about places like Washington, D.C., which had this recent very visible, you know, beatdown of the Doge kid.
Yeah.
And, you look at the numbers and, okay, crime has come down from a peak. Well, so what? Washington, D.C. has
Right.
a higher rate of violent crime than any of the major cities in South America, for
Right.
instance, than that are really that we used to think are these horrific crime-filled places. Washington, D.C., if it were a state, like many Democrats keep thinking it should be, Washington, D.C. would have the highest rate of violent crime of any state in the country. I
Yep.
mean, this is a complete denial of fact. Again, I can't get out of my head, but it's all the exact same thing we saw with COVID. I thought it was about COVID at the time, and now it really isn't. It's about everything. Everything is like that, it seems, which is a very cynical thing to say, but denial of basic evidence, and mainly, instigated by the media. This is a failure of the media. We all watch some news, or whether it's on TV or in the internet, and we see the talking heads, and their initial reaction is, instead of saying violent crime in Washington needs to be fixed, it's the face of our country, really. It's the capital, but also, there's a tremendous number of victims there, and it's just not safe. Instead, we see mainly white talking heads, liberals on TV citing, "Oh, but the crime rate is actually down." Well, so what? I mean, they're real people. I feel there's a tremendous loss of humanity in what you're saying, ignoring the facts. We're living a lie, and meantime, people are dying, and it's just I'm sort of beside myself. I have nothing smart to say about it, except that it's really living the lie is harming people. We saw this in New York. You and I have seen this, cycle in New York City, right? We had Dinkins. The place became a hellhole. Manhattan. Giuliani came in, cleaned it up. Bloomberg continued that cleanup. New York was transformed. Then we saw another reversal during COVID and under de Blasio as mayor of New York. And now it became a hellhole again, really, with overt violence, psychos on the street, drug use in your face, IV heroin addicts injecting, and, all kinds of things very visible. And instead of saying we need to fix this, there's just, again, like some kind of a racial
You.
hatred of whites somehow.
Right.
I mean, I just, again, I don't have a question there, but, you live part of the time, I think you spend quite a bit of your time in New York, even though you're not a New Yorker, even though, and you're a California person, but we see this in the cities in California and everywhere else, Chicago. And, there's no focus on the actual record, on the facts. Instead, somehow it's all about but Trump.
Well, I would say again, I mean, we have to be recognized. If the stats were going up, we would be promoting the stats. They are going down. But and so we're talking about, yes, but it's still too high. I think that's valid, but when it, and to say New York is a hellhole, I agree. And it's different than the early 1990s when you had 2,200 homicides a year. Even with all of the squalor and the attacks and the vagrancy, the pushing people in subways, homicides are still about 350 a year. So we've maintained that. Nevertheless, the quality of life, the condition of the streets is absolutely appalling. There's more of these psychotic, drug addicted people wandering around like they're right out of Bedlam. And we've lost the will as a society to enforce bourgeois values and say, this is not acceptable. The antisocial and the dysfunctional do not have an entitlement to colonize public streets. Those should belong to those who are engaged in commerce, who are respecting the rights of others. And we've simply lost faith as a society, or at least among the elites, to making distinctions about behavior, and instead we embrace the antisocial and the dysfunctional. We hate the bourgeois and the normal and the hardworking. Um, but it is the case to take your side that we define deviance down. To celebrate the fact that homicides are down 14% is ridiculous. I mean, our Europe doesn't have a clue. America is, as you say, such an outlier. Our gun homicide rates are like 48 times higher per capita than Europe. There's nothing like the United States for this degree of gun violence. And the reason we're not going to talk about it, as I say, is because of race. And there's very weird rules. It's the media, and it's, of course, the media is being driven by academia. Criminology now, you would think, criminology, it must be about how policing can work better and, let's fight crime. No, criminology is one of the most left-wing professions in academia now. It is all about systemic racism and how the cops oppress Black communities. It is not about trying to figure out the most effective data-driven uh, policing methodologies.
Right, and then we hear
It
this narrative, by the way, I just wanna interrupt, about, "Oh, it's about gun control." I mean, people don't even think that, there's very little critical thinking going on, but, you take a place like Switzerland, which has a higher per capita gun ownership, they don't have the crime. It's obviously not about the gun laws per se, but somehow, there's always some just silly statement made. And meantime, again, the people are dying, massive crime. It's very distressing to me. And then we started talking about New York, and we see what's happening here. We have the mayoral race where we have somebody nominated by the Democratic Party, Mamdani, who is explicitly anti police, anti-law enforcement, anti-funding of police methods, and instead diverting funds into social programs, etc. He's going to win. That's my point, because
Oh,
it's
yeah.
just not likely that the Democrat nominee wouldn't win. And so, what's happening? Is this just simply that the young voters came out? Are New Yorkers just so blind that they don't want to even admit with their vote what they're seeing with their eyes? What's your assessment of what's going on with the New York voting?
Let me just respond to your gun control point briefly. I
Sure.
would say that touches on one of the big divides between the progressive and the conservative worldview that is sort of constitutional or biological, that progressives will always move to a structural explanation of a problem. They will shy away from personal responsibility, and conservatives look for individual personal responsibility, and are, from a progressive point of view, blind to the big structural factors and systemic factors that determine outcomes. And certainly in the case of gun control, that's absolutely the issue. I think Bernie Sanders years ago pointed out that Vermont has a very, very high rate of gun ownership. It's legal ownership, and there's very low gun crime. The problem is not the guns per se, it's the breakdown of social controls that mean that these kids are absolutely not socialized. They're feral, they're running the streets, but we have double standards. We will apply a personal responsibility test when it's white parents. There was the case of the Ethan Crumbly, who was a school shooter in Ohio, I think, several years ago. And lo and behold, for the first time ever, his parents were prosecuted for allowing him to have a gun. Whereas they're never going to prosecute Black parents that are letting their kids run wild at 2 a.m. and have no knowledge of what their kids are doing. They're held harmless. So it's a completely double standard. as far as,
Of
New
course, by
York.
the way, you know that you're gonna be called a racist from simply that comment, but, you're used
Well,
to it.
I'm gonna say that the racists are those in the media who do not care about Black lives.
Right,
The only
I agree.
Black life they ever cover is if the extraordinarily rare, minuscule moment when, an unarmed Black, so-called, because a lot of these unarmed instances are rather different as they've been categorized, is shot by a police officer. Meanwhile, there's dozens of Blacks every day who were gunned down in homicide. That's more than all whites and Hispanics combined. None of them get covered because the press doesn't give a damn about Black lives. It doesn't give a damn about Black children. If white children get gunned down, that is gonna be a national story. It's complete race hypocrisy on the part of the media, so
Yeah.
I am not going to accept the charge of being a
Oh,
racist for talking
absolutely.
about Black on Black crime. In any case, what's happening in New York, uh, it's the return of the repressed, the academy has been going strong. Trump is taking it on, but it has been fomenting hatred of the West. We saw that with the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas rallies, the incredibly, um, unprincipled demonization of Israel as the biggest problem in the Middle East, and the complete free pass that's given to Hamas and to the tyrants, in Middle Eastern countries, that and that kind of pro-Hamas hatred grows out of a larger pro-Hamas, rather, support and hatred of Israel grows out of a much larger hatred of Western civilization,
Right. Of all
and
of the United States specifically, but also of Western civilization. I completely agree with that.
right, and Mamdani is a product of that world. It couldn't be more perfect. His father's a post-colonial studies professor at Columbia, I think, and so it's an entire ethic, and again, these things go back decades. We saw this in the '60s of the knee-jerk "America is always wrong" response, and I also think the socialist temptation is always with us. If you know nothing about economics, if you are clueless about what it takes to create a business, to operate in a supply chain, the unbelievable responsibility, the decisions you have to make, the difficulty of staying afloat as a business, and you think this is all just an act of expropriation, from the worker or from consumers or whatnot, and you don't understand trade-offs, and you don't understand the inefficiencies of government, the idea that somehow we can vanquish capitalism and government could do things better is incredible. It's
It
incredible. Like
it's
anybody
laughable.
that's
It
been to
is.
the post office, anybody that knows
Yes.
anything about Cuba or about Venezuela, to think that government supermarkets are going to be better run than the post office is sheer fantasy. And yet, it is a it is a way of branding yourself as edgy and lefty, and that has been the hip thing to be for half a century now in the United
Yeah.
States.
But I think even more so now, I agree with you. And I would say that, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm just some old guy now, but I look at the younger generation, under 30s, they are the ones, if you look at the data, who elected Mondani
Right.
in New York. They came out in droves. They have zero historical perspective. And I blame them. I am someone who is very much about personal accountability, but I do realize they are a product of our generation. They're a product, we are the parents'
Right.
generation, and the schools are being taught, the universities, by people in our generation. And so I feel there's this massive problem that the generation that we're in created, but now we're stuck with it, and we have a whole younger generation that to me, then you paint with a broad brush and you make very wrong generalizations because it doesn't apply to everybody, but it's very true that there's an era of entitlement now. In New York, the complaint is, "Oh, I can't afford to live in New York." Okay, then move.
I
Okay, then
know.
get another job. I'm sorry, but or the generation that somehow, oh my God, they can't afford to buy a house until they're 40. Well, that's how I was. But I'm not talking about myself. I mean, the reality is then get another job. Okay, then save more money. Then don't go out to the $100 sushi places in Soho. I mean, it's just there's a generational, at least I have the perception, there's a generation of entitlement here. There's a loss of a work ethic. There's a loss of personal responsibility. Uh, and this is the same generation not only who are voting for the Mamdanis of the world, they're voting for censorship. If you look at the survey, they believe that harmful words should be censored. They're pro-censorship. This is the opposite of the young generation that I was part of. This is the opposite of the '60s and '70s era of young people who were rebelling against restrictions by the government. These people want restrictions. And then you go into, of course, the wholly ignorant protests of what's going on in the Middle East, uh, supporting Hamas. I mean, this is just totally it's an embarrassment, not just to that generation. My point is it's an embarrassment to our generation.
Well, thank you so much for mentioning sushi bars because I find this whole rhetoric about affordability so lachrymose, so saccharine. It's ridiculous. You walk around in New York or any other city, every young person has Starbucks in his hand. They all order bottled water online, which is ridiculous. New York has the cleanest water. Nobody needs to drink bottled water. They go out all the time. They can't bother cooking. They're all using DoorDash. These are consumer habits of the affluent. Nobody, and they all have smartphones, of course. And this is really applies to the inner city ghetto youth that we're supposed to believe are really lacking up opportunities. They all have smartphones. They're throwing their gang signs and their cash and videoing their flash mobs to post on Instagram. No child that has a smartphone is poor. I'm sorry. They are rolling in opportunity. So I completely agree. And the idea that we need government supermarkets because the poor, somebody can't afford food. I don't need to tell you, Scott, this is so obvious. Our problem in the United States is obesity, not nobody's starving to death. We have cheap food going out of our ears. That's the problem. And yet there is this self-pity that's happening now. How again, was it better in the '60s and '70s? I'm not sure. Uh, Arguably, we had the real violence, the bombings in the '60s that we haven't seen here, thank God. We still could, if the
By
we're now
protesters, you're
getting the
talking about.
assassinations. I mean, we're getting Luigi
Yeah.
Mangione and more recently as well, in Midtown Manhattan. So that could happen, and that's one of the most terrifying aspects of our world is the glorification of Mangione and people that are so morally obtuse and stunted that they think that they should be talking about healthcare reform instead of what it took to create a young man who thought he was entitled to gun somebody down and to celebrate that man. I mean, that's very scary stuff.
That is
We're
very
looking at the
scary.
abyss at that point. As far as like the whole left wing view of economics, it's interesting because that goes back very far. You're at Stanford, which was one of the early academic freedom battles in the early 20th century when Jane Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, got upset by the fact that her economics department and sociology department, and a particular a young economist named Edward Ross, was railing against uh, railroad robber barons like Leland Stanford, and she perfectly appropriately, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a real a pariah and outlier on the academic freedom argument. I think she had perfect right to say, "You're not teaching any of this commie stuff in my university. I'm taking my marbles and going home instead." The weight of history is, oh, we support this Edward Ross who she had fired. and because she violated his academic freedom. In any case, sociology, economics has been left wing from the start. Social sciences were predicated on a critique of Western society. But we somehow lived with that within academia for a long time. And there was in the 40s and 50s still an appreciation for private enterprise, for business. It took the 60s for that to really become totally toxic within the university and then start spreading out into this anti-capitalist uh, uh, knee-jerk response by people who are among the most affluent. And the other thing that I would date this to, Scott, is with the growth of affluence in the 50s, because of the wild success of capitalism, teenagers had spending power on their own for the first time in all of human history, and you had a whole youth culture, corporations catering to their taste, and we had a inversion of the true order of things, which is the young should respect the elderly. Now the young control things because they're rich, and they can spend and that also led to just totally perverse, idiotic values.
Yeah, I mean, I actually I today I was listening on my on some for a specific reason to old Margaret Thatcher uh, tapes of interviews and her comments to the parliament. And it made me realize, first of all, she did a lot of privatization. She understood the limits of government were important in a free society. And it was the era of Thatcher and Reagan and of course Milton Friedman. And I wonder if this completely incoherent understanding of the benefits of freedom and free markets and individual empowerment but responsibility for earning money, that whole capitalism view, we're missing today because we don't have Reagan and Thatcher and Milton Friedman types articulating these things. I really think there is a void in people who are clear speakers, clear thinkers, and who have the willingness to speak out. And so, what I see in my view of things, and I'd love to hear what you think about this, is with the election of Trump as the second in his second term, we've had people come out of the woodwork who are the capitalists, I'll call them, the venture capitalists, the billionaire crowd, the business owners who are rich, but they were silent when it was not Trump winning the popular vote. In my view, they were cowards. They wouldn't speak out. They endorsed the DEI efforts of private corporations. They signed on to the pronouns and email signatures and the woke thing. And I think they have also failed in their responsibility to a society that allowed them to have such great wealth. And now they put their fingers up in the wind, and there is a reduced hate of Donald Trump. He won the popular vote, for instance, although it's still, not, it's very divided. I'm wondering what you think about them and sort of in a funny way, how I feel they've failed, and I feel they have a debt to society to educate people about what makes America a free country. And a big part of it is economic freedom and the drive toward individual success.
Well, I'm interested that you said you think they have changed a little bit, and I'm not so sure. I mean, yes, you do have some very salutary changes with regards to corporate DEI policies and speech censorship on some of these media platforms, and
Yeah,
that's
I
very
just mean if I want to clarify. I just mean some of the individuals who are financially successful have at least started speaking up a little bit, but they're still. I agree, and this sort of leads into what you're going to talk about, I think, which is that uh, I'm a little bit worried that Trump is a one-off, and after Trump, we'll see a reversion of all these corporate policies toward DEI and woke. But also, I'm not so sure that there is a structural change. I agree with what I think you're alluding to, which is that they've changed the name of some of these DEI programs or some of these woke programs, but I'm not so sure that there's been a real fundamental change. Go ahead, though.
Well, I mean, one problem is wives. These CEOs have wives, and females are much more left wing. They're much more ignorant about the market. I'm not talking about anybody's daughter and granddaughter in particular, so don't get all hot under the collar, listeners. But on average, I mean, the data is very clear. Females are not informed about public affairs. They do not understand costs and benefits and trade offs and risk. The COVID hysteria, the safetyism was a quintessentially feminized mania in its inability to, again, think rationally about the rational balancing of costs and benefits of any given policy. Zero COVID deaths is just a ridiculous goal. That and the willingness to shut down the economy is based on the same ignorance as we're seeing in Mondami's supporters, in the belief that, well, you shut it down and then just start it up again and everything's gonna be fine. No, it doesn't really work that way. So you have a feminized academy and you have CEOs that have to worry about, are their wives gonna throw them out of the house if they say they're Trump supporters, and that hasn't changed and the academy hasn't changed. So for me, this is the million-dollar question. What does the established elite left look like in 4 years? Can Trump tame it and I wanna say vanquish it, but shrink it enough that it no longer takes control of the culture? Is it enough for one man to stand up there and say, "I don't care. I don't give a damn. You can't scare me by calling me a racist. I don't care." And to go forward and say, "I'm going to support merit. I'm not going to kowtow to the race grift. I'm not gonna kowtow to the gender grift. I know what is true. I know what our values that civilization needs." Will that be enough to get enough people behind him to change things? What does the elite look like in 4 years? And I don't know. I was very optimistic in the first 100 days because the pace of the EOs was so extraordinary, the creativity behind them, the detailed knowledge of where the bodies were buried in the Code of Federal Regulations and the statute books was just extraordinary, and you felt like, there was this tsunami of change, but that may be an optical illusion, that the universities, it's gonna be very hard to change them. Now, this executive order demanding transparency when it comes to admissions data, that is just a nuclear bomb in the heart of the racial preferences regime, because that's all we need. If we can have the data, we can prove very easily where race norming is still going on. There will be a totally different set of standards under which Black and Hispanic students are admitted compared to white and Asians. It's gonna be you can't cover it up, and whether that will change the character of the university, it's harder to prove with regards to hiring because those are more subjective and you don't have the mass data, but
Well, I have
maybe.
2. Let me just interrupt and say
Yeah,
2 things. One is you and I live in a world where, uh, data counts, facts matter. This sounds like some strange statement I'm making, but I actually believe that we are in a country where a huge percentage, I don't think most, but I'm not sure, of people don't care about the facts. They
uh-huh,
have their opinion, they do not care. So, just showing the facts, I'm very concerned that that isn't enough.
I see.
That's point number 1, a very cynical, negative point. And the second point I wanna tag on here is that I agree, there we have a man, uh, President Trump, who is not afraid to say what his eyes are seeing. It's common
Right.
sense. This stuff is undeniable to
Yeah,
any rational person, much of it, most of it, and, it's still well, he's almost done as far as I'm concerned. 2 years from now is a short time, and he is essentially impotent in 2 years, especially, because he's finished, is what I mean, his
yeah.
term. Secondly, executive orders can be reversed, just like
Right.
his executive orders are reversed by Biden, and then he
Of
reversed
course.
Biden's executive orders. And this really, I
Right.
think, was a trend that's more started under Obama than anyone else. From my reading of the history of executive orders, it was accelerating, and it's been accelerating. But so I'm worried those do not have durability.
Mhm.
The people on the left didn't go anywhere. I
Mhm.
work at Stanford, as you pointed out. The place is, in many ways, poisonous, pretending that, oh, we have statements on academic freedom like all these schools do. The statements on academic freedom are complete BS. There's nothing. It's a joke. It's virtue signaling at the highest order.
Sure.
And, so I don't think anybody on the left is gone or disarmed. And, again, I watch MSNBC and CNN, when I'm in the gym, and I see it. And I'm worried, as a corollary to that, that the people on the conservative side, uh, or the libertarianish side, that they're in this. Some of them are they are naive. They think, quote, "We won," unquote. Trump won. Look what he's doing. It's finished. That's a complacency that is so dangerous, and in my belief, is completely just so naive. They didn't win anything. Okay, this is a first step. This is, like the old Rumsfeld quote, it's not the end of anything. It's not the beginning of the end. It's not even the end of the beginning. It's the beginning of the beginning. I think that was Rumsfeld. And this is very, very precarious. This is a victory toward rational thinking, toward reversal of all these very harmful policies that have societal implications. But for one, I don't think there is another Donald Trump after Donald Trump. I don't see him. I see good people. I like several candidates. I don't think there's anyone he's not a politician, and I don't see any of these other people who can fit that fearlessness, that are not politicians, because deep down, as we know, politicians have very different incentives.
Well, this is a really I don't wanna go down this hole as a minor issue of, like, which candidate. I actually would disagree with you on Vance about Vance. I think that he is, in one sense, maybe a better Trump because he can articulate things even more clearly now. He doesn't have the Trump charisma, he doesn't have the Trump base, but I would, if we could have 4 years or 8 years of Vance, I would think that we would stand a chance of rolling this thing back. So, but the question is, Trump does inspire a blind loyalty that I would say in some instances is a little too indiscriminate. And nobody does have that relationship for sure. But I think that, but again, this is like a debate that's far too much in the future of
Yeah.
who's the
It's not
successor.
about individual candidates, really. I'm concerned that Trump is so short term, that somehow, victories are being declared, and they're just very, very temporary and fragile.
Well, and so right, and the problem of the EOs being revocable is absolutely real, and he doesn't have a Senate and a House at this point that can make those statutory changes to put them in place to make them more permanent. So that's a real tough thing. On the other hand, the states actually did start the racial preferences push before Trump came into the White House. They were going after the bureaucracies and looking at the curriculum in maybe some like heavy-handed ways. And it's a very, very difficult issue. And I go back and forth of how much the government should be dictating anything about the content of what is taught. As even though I have a very, very strong views of what should be taught, I'm not I'm worried about setting a precedent for a left-wing government to come in and put its foot down even harder on the neck of universities, and
Yes,
a symbiotic relationship. It's
agree.
not as if a Democratic White House is has an unwilling co-conspirator in doubling down on anti-Americanism. But nevertheless, I'm ambivalent about some of the actions that the Trump administration has taken that push the limits of executive power. Um, so I don't know. I agree with you that we are looking into absolute uncertainty and it's premature to think we could go home. I'm not sure many people do think that. I think people are still trying to push this thing forward, but I'm not sure what one does, given accepting your view that this is at best, right now, all we can say is it's a temporary victory. I don't know what the next step is because there is sort of a division in the right among those people who feel like we have power now, let's use it. It is a war, crush the enemy, procedural niceties be damned. Do whatever you can. And if that involves constitutional crises with the courts, so be it, although fortunately we haven't gone there yet. If it involves, you know, penalizing law firms because you don't like the lawfare they went used against you, that to me is very worrisome, but do it versus should we be more scrupulous about following procedural norms and acknowledging sort of informal constraints on presidential power. I don't know. I tend to be more of a scaredy cat, and despite my best wishes, more of a female on this than maybe a male who's willing to just fight to the death on it. But I don't know, again, what would you do knowing being correct as you are that this is premature to declare victory? What would you do differently than what we're already doing?
Well, I think it does amount to, in my view, having people recognize that the next election is always critical.
Uh-huh.
And I just think I'm concerned about who the next candidate will be. I think there are people who are capable. I personally think, Governor DeSantis is very capable at being the right kind of person who's not afraid to do the right thing. But I think the voters are very fickle, as we all know, and we have this big part of the country that is just simply, we had 70 million people vote for Kamala Harris. I mean, that says something right there. Um,
And I would also say they're not only fickle, but frankly, it's a question whether the majority of people care about those issues that we've been talking about all that much.
right.
The cultural issues, the political issues of how we define Western civilization, even law and order. One could make the case that the only thing that's going to matter is the state of the economy.
Mhm.
And if the economy's bad, it doesn't matter if Trump has managed to get rid of every last diversity sinecure in the government and is, awarding science money based on merit, not based on race and sex. I would think that would be a triumph, but for most people that don't care, and frankly, the trans issue may be a niche issue as well. So yes, so then you get into the whole tariffs question and what he's doing on the economy. And again, I'll just put it out there. I think his firing recently of the economics official in Bureau of Justice Statistics, or rather, labor statistics, was worrisome. I don't like that. I want to play by the rules and don't create a precedent for the left to use its power in a way that violates traditional
Yeah.
norms. But
I,
in any
I, I
case,
agree with that general point, although I do think I'm more cynical than that, and I would say that the left, the extreme left, they don't need a precedent to do stuff.
yeah, well,
But
um,
it's very complicated. I don't want to be negative. That's the point. But it's hard not to be, particularly when you've been inside like I was temporarily and a complete fish out of water there, because there's so few people with integrity, with a core set of beliefs. Trump has a core set of beliefs. Uh, And I think that's not common in politicians, and we've seen it over and over again. I want to finish up with one sort of big cultural issue. You're one of the few people who says very clearly uh, the reality that is so obvious, but again, can't be said, which is that there's been a feminization of American culture. There's been an anti-male hostility, the so-called toxic masculinity narrative that I feel is so harmful to families, family structure, young men, and a successful society. And it's frightening. I'm the father of 2 sons, so maybe it has more personal relevance to me than to some other people, but I see it, and I think it's such a horrific, anti-family narrative, but anti-male narrative that has happened over decades. We've seen this over decades culminate in really, almost not a destroyed. I don't wanna speak too with too much hyperbole, but a male part of our society, young men that have been really harmed, ignored in terms of, this overemphasis of "You go girl," eliminate the so-called glass ceiling. I mean, when is it enough, by the way, when every position is occupied by a woman in the
Right.
entire world and men are I don't know what, but, we see this thing, and I think there's again, a denial of reality. Male men, masculine men are important in a successful society. And if you don't believe that, you really are, there's something wrong psychiatrically, honestly. I feel these people need psychiatric help. But what's your thought on how we have feminized a whole generation of men here for years?
Well, I just love that Trump started disbanding these ridiculous gender councils that Biden proliferated in the federal government beyond what even Obama had done. And, we have like 27 different federal bodies looking at women's health disparities. The women's health disparities are pro-female. I mean, like you talk about nobody cares about facts, but these are the facts. Males die much younger,
Yeah, of
rates
course.
of suicide are much higher, every kind of cancer, blah, blah, blah. And yet we have all of this federal attention going into female health. It's just unbelievable. And you talk about the "You Go Girl" stuff, it makes me sick. Every single big federal, big corporate philanthropy like Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, they all have these Girls Who Code uh, uh, programs, that we've got to get funnel more females into engineering, into computer science. Who cares? I really don't care. And,
Right.
this was the point that got the poor lamb-like innocent James Damore fired from Google, in the 2000s when he said, "Well, maybe there's just a other possible reason besides that Google is discriminating against competitive female engineers. Maybe they're not applying at the same rate. Maybe they're not as interested." And he didn't even really broach the issue of, well, here's the real problem. They don't have the high-end math skills at the same rate as males do. The problem that Larry Summers talked about at the distribution of the curve at the high end and the tail end at the low end, males predominate among math dummies and they predominate among math geniuses. That's just the way it is. And we could talk about why that would have developed evolutionarily, but it is certainly understandable. Um, but we're supposed to pretend that the only allowable reason for the lack of 50-50 gender parity in the STEM professions and other high quantitative skills professions is only racism. It can't be preferences and it can't be skills. So, yes, we have sent a message to males for decades now that they are not wanted. If they're, you had the former head of the National Institutes for Health, Francis Collins, who drove me crazy on a number of grounds, not the least his little Jesus strumming on his guitar. But he said that he would not attend any manels and he wanted his fellow scientists in the biomedicine community to follow his lead. Well, I hope that most of your viewers don't know what a mantle is, because they've been, they're not in the midst of this insanity. But a mantle is any kind of sort of scientific panel or conference that is dominated by males. And in fact, your fellow Hoover Institute scholar there, Neil Ferguson, got in trouble at Stanford for organizing a conference on a new field of history that was, I think, behavioral history, empirical history. He'd reached out to lots of females to participate. He got no's. So the conference was disproportionately male based on a 50-50 assumption. And he was screwed. He was punished by Stanford for that. So there's Francis Collins saying that if an Alzheimer's conference has the best Alzheimer's researchers in the world, the ones who are most likely to make a breakthrough in this thorny problem of neurology and biology, that he's not going to attend it if it's mostly males. This is insanity. This sends a message to males: we don't want you. And
Right.
it has had effect of male participation in schooling. There's been books for years about the war on boys in school. You can't have sports, you can't have contact sports, you can't have competition. We all have to have our own prizes. That does not conform to the male need for hierarchy, for competition, for winning, after which they go on and they form bonds, but they want to know who's the top dog. And I would say, you said it's uh incompatible with a successful society to have this war on males. I would say it's incompatible with civilization per se. It
Right.
is not an accident. It is not a product of systemic misogyny that males brought us the scientific revolution, that they circumnavigated the globe, that they spent centuries tinkering at home in the Royal Society in London in the 17th century, fascinated by how the world works and determined to conquer it with a Promethean spirit. Yes, there's females that have had that drive to conquer, to understand, of course, but it is disproportionately the male of the species that is willing to do stupid things, that is willing to put himself at risk, that
High
is
risk.
willing to be crazy and aggressive, but that has the rewards that we are all parasitic upon. And if we disappear males from civilization, we will be living off the fumes of their accomplishments.
And I think it's really discouraging, like you say, all the masculine traits that are necessary. Otherwise, nobody's gonna, you look down the street, you say, "Boy, I don't see a lot of women sitting on the girders and, for the high risk, buildings that are
Right.
being," I mean, it's so obvious. Where are the women firefighters? Yes, there are some, but I mean, and I'm not brave enough to do those jobs either, by the way. I'm not criticizing her. I'm saying the obvious, which is, it's good to have masculine males. And, I just think it is another thing. I wonder, I'm sure there are studies, I just don't know the data on how to measure a feminization of a culture. But I'm very concerned about that. And I do think, like a lot of the other issues we've talked about here, that the pendulum has to swing so far to get things in a bad state before people wake up and fix it. And I think we have seen that somewhat in some of these things that are happening today. So maybe that's what the result of the New York City mayoral election will be. That eventually, okay, I mean, that's what you voted for, but in addition, you need to see a bad result before you can really personally experience something enough to fix it. And I think the wake up call might be that.
Well, I was just at a teaching fellowship for young conservatives, and for me, the question is, when are white males just going to stand up and say, we're not taking this any longer? Because they are the bottom of the totem pole. They're discriminated against in every law school, every medical school, every engineering school, every business program. They're discriminated against in hiring, in college admissions. they have to be twice as good, and, of course, if you're an Asian male, good luck to you, really. But are they gonna put up with this phony narrative about them much longer? And these younger people and I wonder, like, the people who listen to, I don't know, Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, are they organizable as a block? Uh, and they seem to think that, yeah, that the sort of younger white males get it. They understand how the world is totally rigged against them. And so maybe at some point, um, there will just be, I don't know what it would look like, but some kind of backlash against the false narrative of white male misogyny, supremacy, racism, patriarchy, you name it. I would add, you talk about female firefighters. I think the real distinction is you don't see female sanitation workers. They do wanna be firefighters because that's a high prestige job, and the reason they're not is not necessarily because they don't have the courage, although they don't, but they just don't have the skill, the strength rather. It's absurd. There should be no females in firefighting, period. I'm sorry. You do not have the upper body strength to pull your fellow firefighter who weighs 200 pounds, he's got another 100 pounds of pack on him out of a burning building. So no female firefighters. But the real issue is they're not being garbage cleaners or going down into mines because, yes, it takes courage and there's no prestige there. The females want the jobs that, they can feel like they're besting the males, and they're picking and choosing their battles, and that's ridiculous.
Well, yeah, and, it just reminds me, I was at a small gathering recently when there was, someone speaking who Navy SEAL, who was involved in the Bin Laden. I don't wanna name who it was who said this, but, in the Bin Laden mission, and somebody in this very small group there were only about 30 of us there, said, well, talking about Navy SEAL training, we're all, and there were something like 25 Navy SEALs on that mission, 24, 25. And he said, someone interrupted and said, "Well, were they all men?" And I thought, first of all, the question is so asinine. I mean, who
Ugh,
cares, number
who
1, but
cares?
number 2, the person who was this person did a double take. He was stunned by the question because it's so asinine, and he said, "Well, yes, all men." I mean, you know, why wouldn't you want someone who's physically capable of being the elite Navy SEAL? It has nothing to do with anything else except reality. So, there's this stunning, I hope we're seeing the end of that, but I don't know, and I sort of think your book, When Race Trumps Merit, I think was the name of the book, but it's there's another part of it which really goes sort of unspoken, and that is when gender trumps merit. Okay? I don't care if equal numbers of women are United Airlines pilots. I
I
just
know,
want somebody good.
I know.
I'm in medicine. I've worked in clinical neuroscience I did it for 25 years. There were very few female neurosurgeons. Why is that? It's not big. I mean, it's ludicrous to think that it's due to discrimination. It's because women don't want that job where
Right?
you're 60 years old, you're still flying in 24/7 on the helicopter because there's a head trauma case or a ruptured aneurysm.
Yeah,
Who wants that job? Okay, I mean, it's rational to not want that job. And by the way, I'm happy that women choose not to have that job and maybe instead have some time for a family. I think this is one of the other untold stories, or at least less told, is that when you villainize women for staying home to have children, which is something that's been going on for 50 years,
right.
uh, and that demonization, that villainization is done by women. Men don't do that demonization. It's only women that do that, that have made staying at home, having a child, as somehow less than having a job. This is really one of the most destructive things, I think, ever in any society. And we're seeing the fertility rates and all that as a secondary impact from that.
Well, it's the suicide of the West that you mentioned before. The only sex that we celebrate is non-procreative sex.
Right.
Every gay pride march, and I'm sorry, being female is not an accomplishment, being gay is not an accomplishment. I don't know what we're celebrating, but every time we're celebrating some LGBTQ thing, we are celebrating by definition non-procreative sex, and the traditional family structure gets no support whatsoever. And yeah, females are mocked for having their comparative advantage in any situation is going to be raising their own child. I find it amazing that females are so determined. They've got such a chip on their shoulder to compete against males that they think they're best off. Their comparative advantage is staying up till midnight drafting interrogatories for Sullivan and Cromwell rather than watching the hour by hour development of their child picking up language, and that can be farmed out to a third world immigrant who's got a better control of language and cognition than she does, and she's better off. It's an absurd
It's
division of
absurd
labor,
and
and
so harmful.
it's all based on this chip on the shoulder, and you talked about entitlement earlier, Scott, and I've just never felt this. As a female, I've never felt like I have to define myself against males or that I somehow can vicariously feel offended by the fact that in the 19th century, females didn't have voting rights. I don't care. I don't, I look at myself today. I have everything available to me. I have more than I deserve available to me because I am, of course, a constant beneficiary of gender preferences, which I don't want and I resent, but that's our world. And so why should I go around feeling angry because there was not equal rights sometime in the past? Today, there are equal rights, and I do not feel like any male's success is at my expense.
Right. There's so many things, and I could go on for another hour. We could exchange times ranting about things, but it would sort of be duplicative, I have a feeling.
Yeah.
So, Heather, it was great chatting. Thank you for making yourself available. Congrats on your 2025 award,
Oh, thank you.
the Edmund Burke Award, and so many awards that I fully made our audience aware of in your intro.
I
And
appreciate it.
pleasure to see you again.
Thank you so much, Scott. Great talking to you.
All right, thanks. Thank you for listening to Independent Truths with Scott Atlas. If you'd like to find out more about Heather MacDonald, today's guest, check out her Manhattan Institute webpage, follow her on Twitter, look at her interviews in the news, and don't forget to subscribe to this show on YouTube, Spotify, and everywhere else you're listening to podcasts today. And I'll see you next time.